The biggest problem with this is that when every single day, no matter what happens in the news, the President of the United States and the people who work for him say things that are patently untrue. When that happens, it is not just a credibility problem for the President of the United States. It becomes a credibility problem for the United States. And what that means is that when this president at some point has to tell the American people something that is very important for us to know for our safety, for our security, what happens when a lot of people, even people maybe who voted for him, don't believe him? Yeah. It puts us in danger, and it puts us in danger when other countries can't believe
Jennifer, I have 30 seconds left here. Do you feel like this president is writing his own press releases now? That cannot be good for the country.
No, I really do. I really think that he is. Those scripts that you heard from both Hope Hicks and Sean Spicer, it's very clear that that's coming from the president himself. No staff person would ever do it because you understand it's destructive and counterproductive. And, you know, I really agree with what Jason said. I think of everything that I'm concerned about with the Trump presidency, the fact that the world and the United States, that Americans can't rely on the President of the United States to tell the truth and can't take him at his word is a very destructive and scary things. And you know, you saw that. You saw with like Merkel, what Merkel said this weekend, that you know the Russian or that Europe and America Europe can't rely on us.
What about the story that? What about this fake news story that Comey had asked for more money for the investigation? Not true at all. What about the story about Rosenstein that was that he said he was going to resign? Not true at all. What about the story about the Martin Luther King bus that was moved out of the Oval Office?
You're talking about stories. You're talking about stories. Those weren't stories, and you don't know if any of those are true or not.
All of those are true.
But listen, but here's the thing: those were not put out to intentionally deceive someone. That is what fake news is. It's not stories that you disagree with, or sometimes when reporters or news organizations make a mistake and then clarify or say they were wrong. That's not fake news. That's the way the world works. Are you always perfect? Do you always say the right thing? Do you always speak? Do you always know the exact answer?
There's absolutely fake news. And Don,
you didn't answer my question, Jack.
There was
Jack, you didn't answer my question. Jack, are you perfect?
I absolutely am not.
Okay, then no one is and no organization is. Have a great weekend. Good night, all.
United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us, Ambassador Haley.
Good morning, Jake.
So 194 countries have signed the Paris Climate Agreement. Only 3 nations are not signatories to it: the United States, Nicaragua, which thought the emission standards were not tough enough, and Syria. So on the one issue that unites the world, essentially, the United States is now isolated, the proverbial skunk at the garden party. Are you not concerned that this will affect your ability to lead on other issues?
Well, I don't think we're the skunk at the party. I think that what we did was we watched out for our country. Look, I was a governor in South Carolina. I know how tough those regulations President Obama put on us because of the Paris Agreement were on our businesses and on our industries. It directly hit our jobs. And so what we want to do is say, look, we are a sovereign country. We're going to make sure we're looking out for the U.S. first. We will always be a leader in the environment. That's what we do. That's who we are. But we're going to make sure that we're not hurting our companies in the process. And there is a balance. There is clearly a difference between us and Nicaragua and us and Syria. The world knows that. So to put us in that category is not a real assumption.
No, I'm not the one to put us in the category. The president is. But when it comes to those agreements, the reduction in carbon emissions, that was every country set their own standard. Why didn't President Trump just renegotiate the United States standards to make it less imposing? Why withdraw?
Why didn't President Obama get this through the Senate? There's a reason President Obama did this from an executive standpoint as opposed to going through the Senate, because he knew he couldn't get it to pass. It was too onerous. The regulations were too strict, and it wasn't achievable, even if we had stayed in the Paris Agreement. And this is the part everyone needs to really think about. If we had stayed in the Paris Agreement, which the countries told us, oh, you can do it, we won't say anything, that's not who the U.S. is. One, we're truth tellers. We're going to tell the truth. 2, it was not achievable. What President Obama submitted the U.S. to was not achievable under our standards or any other country's standards. And then we've got to look at the fact we didn't want to be in violation of the agreement. And if you look at the executive order that President Trump signed that rolled back the Clean Power Act a few months ago, that was already moving towards a pro-business situation. But what we do have is a lot of companies who care about green technology, care about making sure that we take care of the environment. And you have a president who's very focused on clean air, clean water, and jobs.
Well, you say we're truth tellers. Let me show you what President Trump has tweeted about climate change. Quote, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive," unquote. Are you willing to acknowledge that that is nonsense?
What I will tell you is the regulations from the Paris Agreement were disadvantaging our companies. We know that. I knew that as a governor. We know that now. The jobs were not attainable as long as we had to live under those regulations. It wasn't possible to meet the conditions under the Paris Agreement had we even attempted to do that. And so I think we have to look at what's realistic. We've got a president who is going to watch out for the environment. It's what we do. It's who we are. We're going to continue to be a leader in the environment. The rest of the world wanted to tell us how to do it, and we're saying we will do it, but we'll do it under our terms.
But the standards were set by the United States for the United States. But just to be clear on this, climate change
the standards were set by President Obama and not passed through the Senate because the standards couldn't have been achieved.
No, but my point is, you said that the world was imposing standards on the United States. President Obama, the president of the United States at the time, is the one who set the standards. But moving that aside for 1 second, I just want to be clear on this. You're not willing to acknowledge that calling climate change a Chinese hoax is just a big box of crazy.
President Trump believes the climate is changing, and he believes pollutants are part of that equation. So that is the fact. That is where we are. That's where it stands. He knows that that it's changing. He knows that the U.S. has to be responsible with it, and that's what we're going to do. Just because we got out of a club doesn't mean that we don't care about the environment.
Let's talk about another club that we're in, NATO. One of the biggest concerns in Europe right now is that President Trump visited NATO headquarters, but was not willing to publicly reiterate the U.S. commitment to Article 5, that the principle that an attack on one nation in NATO is an attack on all. Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested this weekend that these squabbles at NATO are helpful to Russia. I understand that the president wants every country to pay its fair share, of course, but why was the president not willing to underscore the United States' commitment to our allies in NATO?
Because there was no change to policy. Of course we believe in Article 5. I just met with all of my NATO ambassadors yesterday. We've said a threat on one of us is a threat on all of us. NATO is going to continue to be strong. It's going to continue to be united. Russia's going to try and divide it, but the truth is we've never swayed from Article 5. We honestly still believe it. The president mentioned it because he wasn't changing it. And so the focus is always going to be on taking care of each other.
But why can you say it on my show, but President Trump can't say it at NATO headquarters? You know, he has made comments along the lines of that he's not sure that the United States would be there for NATO countries that aren't paying their fair share. European allies, you know this better than I do, but I've talked to some of our European allies. They needed to hear him reaffirm Article 5. How come you can do it, but he can't?
He could if you asked him. I mean, I think if you asked him if he was in favor of Article 5, he would say yes, he is. His intent was to make sure that the burden sharing was happening. And I think we want that in this day and time when we're seeing so many threats around the world. We just want to know our NATO allies are paying their fair share. And they look at how they've stepped up. They're all stepping up. They all acknowledge the fact that we have to be strong militarily. We have to be strong united. And I think we're going to do that. So there's never been a wavering or any sort of thought of changing from Article 5. The U.S. is strong with Article 5. We're always going to take care of our friends. We expect our friends to always take care of us. That's been a long-standing rule. That's not going to change.
I'd love to ask President Trump, but he won't give me an interview. But let's move on. Yahoo's Michael Isikoff is reporting that in the early weeks of the Trump administration, there was an effort by the White House to push the State Department to begin to lift sanctions against Russia. Now, this week, Trump advisor Gary Cohn wavered on whether the president will reconsider sanctions against Russia. Help me understand something. Given the meddling in the U.S. election last year, which you, not the president, but you have unequivocally stated happened, and the continued Russian occupation of Crimea, not to mention what's going on in eastern Ukraine, why would the Trump White House ever even consider easing sanctions against Russia?
I'm not aware of that. So everything I know is that we have said we're going to keep our sanctions strong and tough when it comes to the issue in Ukraine. I've said that publicly. We'll continue to say that. There's no easing up on Russia until they start really becoming part of the Minsk agreement and following through on what they're supposed to do. And we're going to continue to look at the elections. We absolutely think Russia meddled in the elections, and I think Congress is dealing with that, and we'll see what happens.
Well, so you're not aware of it, but it did happen. The White House didn't dispute the report, and the former State Department official, Daniel Fried, who went to Capitol Hill to try to get the sanctions codified for fear that this would happen, has stated on the record this happened. There's also been a lot of talk and reporting about Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and a senior advisor, trying to establish back-channel communications to Russia. Were you aware of those?
No, I was not aware of any of that, if that happened. And really, Jake, there's so many rumors back and forth. It's the reason why I think that, this investigation needs to move forward swiftly, get the facts out on the table so that we can all move on.
The Washington Post reported that Jared Kushner wanted to use the Russian embassy to make secure phone calls to the Kremlin. Is that something that you, as U.S. ambassador to the UN, would ever consider doing, making phone calls from the embassy, a Russian embassy, where the Russians could hear you, but Americans couldn't?
First of all, I don't know that to be fact. So I can't sit there and agree with an assumption that you're saying. What I can tell you is no, I wouldn't do that. But at the same time, I'm not in that inner circle in the administration. I do my job at the United Nations, and Jared continues to do his job there at the White House. And until we see facts, it's hard to respond to something like that.
I want to turn to Israel because I know this is an issue important to you. During the campaign, President Trump made a very specific promise. Take a listen.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem.
President Trump this week obviously signed an order this week that will, at least for now, keep the American embassy in Tel Aviv. We know that the president styles himself as something of a deal maker. Is he hoping to use the location of the U.S. embassy as leverage in a potential peace deal?
I think that he knows that it could be very much a part of the peace process. And so I think that what he did want to do is make sure that he wasn't interrupting the negotiations that are happening with the peace process. I think that they feel like it's moving forward in a constructive way, and he didn't want this to get in the way. He hasn't changed his position on moving the embassy. It's all about time. So I think that he wants to see how the peace process plays out and then handle it accordingly.
All right, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, thank you so much for your time today. We always appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.